Today I would like to speak about a minor topic which I think will also take me less time, but let's say what my rambles will really last this point. That is let's say the ideological aspects of the Medician domination, which telling the truth it's a very big thing, considering the implications in political theory and philosophy and social and economical differences. Um, and I think it's quite interesting to obviously understand it in perspective, especially in this video, a political perspective, and and especially um, at the at the rise of the Medici dynasty, we can say freely. At the times of Cosimo de' Medici, as you know, um, became de facto Lord of Florence by installing his own family as the leading, um, the leading, lineage, we can say, um, in Florence, and he had to produce in a certain way an ideological picture, an ideological figure of and legitimation of his own power and the one of his family. Because Cosimo de' Medici, as you know, the Medici rose in Florence as bankers. They didn't belong to, initially in Florentine history in the lower Middle Ages, to the oldest families and the richest families. I mean, they were relatively old, considering that we find the Medici already in the 13th century, and possibly even earlier, if I'm not wrong. But they hadn't been the major, families during the 14th and early 15th century. They rose to power through an incredibly lucky and and also deserved financial growth. They were quite skilled as bankers, and they managed to hegemonize the political life of Florence. And this power obviously was not the only one present present in Florence, and there were other families that up to that point had a certain power during the previous generations in Florence, that there had already been a sort of push and tendency towards the lordship. Excuse me. And what I find to be interesting in this sense is the fact that Cosimo de' Medici gained a huge personal power, but he did not assume any titles of any juridical titles of seigneurial rule. It was quite common in Italy at that time, since more than a century at that point, to for Italian cities to elect a lord, a signore, so called in Italian, that was mainly a figure that rose to power because the people, the popolo, so the middle class actually elected them as leaders of the city, and there was a formal sanction of these titles, like you became dominus of that city, hmm? Because the public assemblies elected you to be so. Then many lords obviously forced this most of the time, so it wasn't a clean, nice political change that saw everybody happy of it. But since the political landscape of Italy was extremely agitated, and these figures could that were often part of noble families who had already quite of a power that could be used to defend cities, could provide some stability. But Florence wasn't like the other Italian cities, and we'll see why in a while. And Cosimo de' Medici, while becoming de facto Lord of Florence, didn't um, didn't assume any seigneurial title in order to, let's say, mediate between some both political and ideal traditions in Florence. First of all, there was a peculiar trait of Florentine culture that was the idea of the free municipal institutions. Mm. The Florentines exalted their own political freedom above anything else. They had believed that their republic, um, because Florence had a so-called republican political system, were the most, the purest political tradition that could be found uh, in Italy. Um, the reasons were many. Let's say that this republican or democratic, if you want, tradition that the Florentine system um, had was born substantially at the beginning of the 14th century. Mm. It was already present more or less in every popular, um, mm, let's say, political aim at the time, meaning that obviously the popular um, party wanted obviously to maintain the idea that there wasn't a lord and that everybody ideally in the city were were capable of ruling jointly in participating to public assemblies and so on. And Florence was one of the few cities in Italy, actually the only one in practice, that was able to get rid of the 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 party of the so-called tycoons, we can't say today, the magnates, that at the time mainly corresponded to, although it's not overlappable anymore this time, with the class of the knights. So these nobles that had more than a strictly, uh, mm, you know, class connotation, sort of lifestyle and power deriving from owning properties outside the city and dealing with other lords in the countryside and in other cities, and that could therefore have an external base of power that could be used to control the city, because this is how many lordships actually rose to power in communal Italy. Florence, as I said, got rid of these guys immediately, and they got rid of them completely. And they established a system that was made up of the greatest economical guilds and the greatest economical corporations that obviously were led by extremely wealthy figures, that however had a urban and mostly mercantile background, that therefore were firmly rooted within the city itself, and ruled the city as the real center of power, and not by winking at someone else outside, or building sort of feudal assets outside, and were truly democratic in the sense that they belonged to the popolo of Florence. And this asset had substantially made it because Florence had an extremely wealthy mercantile class at that time, and that's the reason why they had risen to power, and managed not to make any lordship formed, although as we see both with Medici and other families at the beginning of the 15th century, there were leading families that de facto ruled over the others, or at least had an hegemonical power that could be in practice exercised over the world citizenry. But the Florentines were so much in love with their own ideas of republicanism that there was no way Florence could see the official rise of a lord. Parts of the reason why this had happened as well was an ideological weapon used as such, as an enemy, against an enemy of the Florentine Republic, that had been back in the days during the 14th century, the 15th century, the Visconti. The Visconti, as you know, were the lords of Milan. They had been the strongest family in Italy since the half of the 14th century, and they had managed in practice to almost bring under their own dominion the whole northern and central Italy. And Florence had fought bitterly against their expansion, and they had fought many wars, and the Florentines weren't much of a warlike people at this time, because the popular politics and republicanism was the expression of certain estates that didn't that weren't made up of professionals of war. They were mostly merchants and people who preferred to pay other people to fight for them. And the Visconti, who had a very troubled history, meaning that their lordship was extremely powerful, but at the same time also very unstable because of internal strife between the family members of the dynasty. Excuse me. Were were very different from the Florentines. The Visconti had risen to power as a minor family stemming from the Lake of Como, close to Milan, and they had um, a completely different political view from the Florentines, because they were lords. And what lords? They got the power in Milan through bitter fights against the fiercest enemies of the Della Torre family, and they had built a dominion in Milan finally by exploiting a very efficient military system that they created with mercenaries um, and with a great support from many political sides, including the German kings, and basically subduing great part of the Po Valley under their own rule with force, but also with bankers as well. The Milanese financial wealth was a quite big thing that backed this Visconti's expansion. But the idea it was that the Visconti were lords and a dynasty, and that there was no room essentially for a republican or popular order. Milan obviously had its own popolo, but let's say that in Milan as well as in whole Lombardy, the popolo never actually made it to rule um, for a very long time. Especially Milan, the um, the social classes had always contemplated aristocracy, the bishop, and the people, and basically just during the Ambrosian Republic, that is in the 15th century, a very short time, was the only experience of a popular government in Milan. So the Visconti had this very strong um, iron fist over which they ruled over a great part of northern Italy. The Florentines obviously saw in this family and their political model um, the exact opposite of what their own view of politics was really about. And and since they were menaced by, they were threatened by Milanese invasion and conquest, the Florentines during these wars had fabricated even more, even a greatly, in a more sophisticated way, um, this ideology of the free institutions against tyranny, essentially, because the Visconti were seen as the prototype of tyrants in Italy. And telling the truth, it's a bit of there is a lot of hypocrisy in here. Not just because the Florentines themselves ruled essentially through an oligarchic system, like the one of the Medici actually was, but also because they had been allied um, with tyrants themselves. I mean, the Florentines had been allied to certain lords of other cities in order to fight their wars. They had been the pupils of the Angevins and of their kingdom in Naples. So obviously they were stressing the differences between freedom and tyranny, most of all to discredit the Milanese and the Visconti and the Sforza, who had risen to power at the beginning of the 15th century and were de facto continuing the the seigneurial tradition over Milan and its domains. And and the Milanese threat was still alive in this time. You know, the political balance in Italy at this time was basically Florence, um, at least in central northern Italy, Florence, Venice, Milan, and occasionally Savoy, fighting in order mainly it was mainly to stop Milanese expansion. That's the reason, by the way, why, for instance, Venice during this time expands in the so-called terraferma, that is basically the dry land, terra firma, mainland, how you want to call it, um, and arriving very close to Milan because they wanted to form this very big um, um, pad um, against Milanese expansion. So the threat was always there, and when Cosimo de' Medici came to power, obviously there was there were actually um, there was still much to be done in order to put things their own place in the political balance, um, and they had to take a position, and um, there was therefore a clash um, during this time between two literates, two men of letters, two humanists at this time. We are, you know, between um, the, um, the end of the 14th and the beginning of 15th century. There were Antonio Loschi and Coluccio Salutati. Who were these guys? Well, Antonio Loschi was a humanist at the court of Gian Galeazzo Visconti, who was one of the major figures of the Milanese um, um, dynasty of the time. He was the first Duchy of Milan, and obviously Lord of Milan, and had extended his own power over an extremely large quantity of cities that made up the Visconti's domains at that time. And he obviously pushed much for, you know, strengthening from his side his ideological um, his prerogatives from an ideological point of view. Coluccio Salutati instead was the humanist chancellor of the Florentine Republic, very famous, important also for, you know, for his intellectual activity, but also the kind of reform of writing and other interesting aspects of Western culture of the time that we don't have the time to talk about now. And these two, Antonio Loschi and Coluccio Salutati, got quite firstly involved into an ideological debate on freedom and tyranny. So essentially they were attacking each other, and through that attacking respectively the Florentine model and Milanese model, showing with from their own perspective that was opposite, but they were very intelligent men, so with great lucidity, and how the two political conceptions that were supporting actually reflected a different asset, different organization of the Italian peninsula. Because Antonio Loschi said that the Visconti's domination was the only one that capable of granting stability to the whole Italy. Um, and um, and Coluccio Salutari obviously instead believed that the Florentine freedom that was obviously waived by Florence first of all, but could be uh, theoretically adopted by all the other Italian cities, and um, was the only one to grant the freedom of Italy. So what we see here are two very different um, political and institutional paths um, um, that corresponded to very different socio-economical and cultural systems, and at the beginning of the modern age, more or less, um, that used the work of humanists in order um, to praise themselves and to, make propaganda um, against their opponents. And it's very interesting as a this dual perspective of how stability or freedom had to be achieved in Italy. As I said before, it was a matter of hypocrisy because both systems weren't anything like we can imagine of modern democratic assets. Actually, the Florentine Republic is much closer to it, and we obviously recognize it as maybe Florence having been the cradle of Western, modern political culture. That is indeed true because Florentine humanism, especially in political conceptions, was really influential in the shaping of the of modern European culture and political culture, which was definitely Italian indeed. And it's no chance that these conception actually took much from the Roman perspective. These were times in which obviously the Roman antiquities, the classic antiquities of the Hellenic and Roman political systems were quite highly praised and studied and imitated. So the Florentines, as many others after them, believed that their political system was the best because it resembled more the Roman one, the Republican one, telling the truth, not the imperial. Maybe the Visconti pushed more for the imperial Roman model. I don't know how much though. It would be interesting to check that. And Florence, however, as I said, wasn't a real democracy. Wasn't a democracy as we conceive it today. It was a democracy in the sense that the citizenry had some political power, but as we have seen with the rise of the Medici dynasty, basically Cosimo de' Medici had an hegemony over the city and a huge factual political power, because with all the money he had could basically buy the whole city and to regulate certain dynamics, certain mechanisms that we can't think them to be democratic. But the result was stability. The result was, the Medici lordship that so much gave to our culture. So it's even controversial to see, what do we really come from, and where do the idea that today we praise actually stem, and in these contexts, what was the actual level of freedom that people who inhabited in them really had. Um, on the other hand, the Milanese perspective was um, more obscure in the sense that I believe it was less. First of all, it produced less in terms of political and ideological speculation because Milan wasn't Florence. Milan was much more a warlike um, political system and much less of a cultural, um, mm, you know, point. Uh, Even though Milan had a court with a lot of intellectuals, here we saw Loschi, but there were also many. Milan was also quite international center in Europe. It had a great contacts with the Kingdom of France, with Savoy, with the Habsburgs. So, in many ways, the political, the you know, the Milanese court had many external political and cultural influences that made it grow. But let's say that what the Visconti and later the Sforza were mainly interested was in maintaining their political power, their military power, and to manage to fight to maintain this power. So it was much more about the sword than the pen, we can say. But also for this ideological production relatively to the the importance of the Milanese political system, I think it's also quite interesting because the Florentine perspective is great. We can mirror ourselves in this republicanism that sounds so good and it's so good, the idea of freedom. But I think the Visconti's perspective is more fascinating because one thing is idealism and the idea that we can be all free as if, civilization came just from being free. Well, it wasn't just like that. And same Florentine system spoke for it, meaning that they were all but free in practice because only one family ruled the world stuff, and incidentally it produced a lot of culture and civilization. But the idea of state, in the terms of power, and of a power that is able to be affirmed and assured and maintained over time, is something that requires also very bad things and a military presence and a deterrence that was mainly caused by the threat of a military intervention. So it was interesting what Losky wrote about the stability of Italy and of the Italian system, meaning that answering to freedom, he said, yeah, you can be free, but this will basically bring to to how Italy was 1 century before, where there were all many small city-states that did nothing but fighting against each other. If there is instead a sort of big authority that is able to maintain order and peace and a sort of unified um, and homogeneous political dominion, there is gonna be maybe there is not gonna be freedom, but there is gonna be stability. And sometimes it's much better to have stability than freedom because the one, maybe the stability offers you life, while freedom doesn't grant you maybe not even that, because you could be defeated and killed in a way. Um, and another perspective that I that really intrigues me is the point of that these two powers, Florence and Milan, we're actually talking about a system that had to be reflected not in theory all over the world, but in Italy. And I think it's very interesting this because Italy at this time we know was the most advanced country in Europe. It produced so much in terms of wealth, of art, of literature. It was an incredibly complex yet incredibly um, productive system. Mm. And and these two perspectives that we have just seen were thought for Italy. I mean, for a system that apparently was basically devoid um, of any order, because it's true that in the 15th century the Italian states were much more rationally built, territorially speaking. There was much more order. There were much less little states and more regional entities. So they were going towards, the centralization of these lands essentially, and abandoning the city-state model that had been there from the 11th to the 14th century. They were pushing towards something else, to something more unified. So it's interesting that these guys were thinking about giving an order to be imitated in the whole country, at least in northern Italy, where the urban tradition was quite homogeneous. The south was something else. It was a kingdom, in fact, and it was a feudal. It had a feudal organization. But for Italians, evidently of the center and of the north, these two assets probably reflected a political debate that was going on at that time, not just to justify a political system over another, and being being as an instrument of political power like these humanists were being. But it was a concrete political problem, because the point was, what do we want to do? And consider there had been many wars going on. There were people dying, money being lost, and a settlement that was always quite unstable. So who did have to win? As we know, the Medici eventually were the promoters of this political equilibrium that would rule in Italy until the death of Lorenzo the Magnificent and the Italian Wars. But it's still very fascinating that a region in Europe that was, historically credited with these chronic political fragmentation could produce the idea of, independently from which side this was proposed, of a common asset, a common political model that could be more or less shared by anyone. And I think it's meaningful to talk about these aspects because they get deeper into the political conceptions of the times that are something strictly related to what ultimately one has to do or doesn't have to do in practice, in everyday life, because these affected really everyday life. And we can even make a comparison with today's world, obviously with the with necessary distinctions, but always bearing in mind that certain problems in history come back. They're not the same situations because history never repeats itself, never. But there are certain parts of what happened in the past, some aspects that can help us to understand what is going on today. And I think it's very intriguing intellectually. So I thank you for listening, and to the next video.